I had a feeling my husband was about to leave me, so I secretly protected my inheritance first. Just 2 weeks later, he filed for divorce, but the moment he found out he would not get a single cent, he begged me to take him back on his knees. My name is Cassidy, 34 years old, and my husband thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess. He just did not realize I had already flipped the board. Before I dive into exactly how I orchestrated his downfall, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic partner who thought they could walk all over you. The beginning of the end started on a totally unremarkable Friday night. I was sitting at the dining room table of our upscale Chicago townhome, pushing a piece of grilled salmon around my plate. Across from me sat Bradley, my husband of 5 years. At 36, Bradley was a mid-level corporate consultant who carried himself like he was the chief executive officer of a Fortune 500 company. He took a slow sip of his expensive red wine, the kind he insisted we buy to maintain appearances, and looked at me with that familiar patronizing smile. "So when exactly is the wire transfer clearing?" he asked, his voice dripping with forced casualness. "We have been waiting on your Uncle Richard's estate for months, Cassidy. My startup needs that capital injection by Monday." I set my fork down, trying to keep my voice even. "Bradley, I am still not entirely comfortable dumping the entire $4.5 million into our joint account. My financial advisor said it is safer to keep inherited assets in a separate trust until we have a solid business plan for your consulting firm." Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "A business plan, Cassidy. Honey, you are a UX UI director. You make buttons look pretty on smartphone apps. You are basically a highly paid screen decorator. I am the investment genius in this family. Do you really think you understand market scaling better than someone who consults for global enterprises?" His words were designed to make me feel small, a tactic he had perfected over the years. When he called me a screen decorator, it was not the first time he had belittled my profession. He resented my success because it highlighted his own mediocrity. He spent his days consulting for businesses that rarely implemented his advice, while I managed a massive team shaping products used by millions. But at home, he demanded absolute authority. I usually let him have his way to keep the peace, believing that a healthy marriage required compromise. Now I realized my compromise was just another word for capitulation. He expertly minimized my career so I would hand over the financial reins without question. "We are a team." He continued, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his. His touch felt cold. "If we put the money in the joint account, we can immediately leverage it for business loans. If you lock it away in some trust, you are just letting inflation eat it alive. I am trying to build an empire for us, baby. Do you not trust your own husband?" There it was, the classic guilt trip. If I hesitated, I was a bad wife holding back his brilliant potential. I looked into his eyes and saw nothing but hungry anticipation. He was not looking at his partner. He was looking at a walking lottery ticket. He wanted me to hand over the inheritance my uncle had worked his entire life to build, all so he could play businessman. "I will call the bank first thing Monday morning." I lied smoothly, pulling my hand away to reach for my water glass. "I just want to make sure the routing numbers are correct." Bradley beamed, his entire demeanor shifting from aggressive to triumphant. "That is my smart girl. You focus on making those apps look nice, and let me handle building our wealth." After dinner, Bradley settled into the living room with a large glass of bourbon to watch a basketball game, his mood visibly elevated by the prospect of incoming millions. I excused myself, saying I needed to grab my phone charger from his home office upstairs. I had no intention of snooping. I really just needed a charger. But when I walked into his meticulously organized office, the screen of his iPad was glowing brightly on the desk. He had forgotten to lock it before coming down for dinner. I reached for the charging cable tangled near the device, but my eyes caught a glimpse of the open application. It was an Excel spreadsheet. What made my blood run cold was the title saved at the very top of the screen: Exit Strategy. I stopped breathing. My hand hovered over the tablet. I knew I should walk away, but a sickening intuition rooted me to the floor. The sheer audacity of it left me paralyzed for a moment. He had not even tried to hide it. He was so confident in his control over me, so certain I would never question him or look at his devices, that he left the blueprint for my financial ruin sitting right on his desk. I leaned in closer to read the rows of meticulously calculated data. Column A listed my exact inheritance amount down to the penny, $4,500,000. Column B was labeled Community Property Split. Underneath it was a complex formula dividing the money exactly in half. But it did not stop there. Bradley had created an entire financial forecast for his life without me. He had deducted estimated legal fees, spousal support buyout costs, and the penalty for breaking the lease on our townhome. In column C, under a bolded header titled Bradley's Net Walkaway, sat a number that made my stomach churn. $2.2 million. He had calculated taxes. He had factored in the expected appreciation of the funds once they hit our joint account. He had even added a row for liquidating the vintage car collection my Uncle Richard had left me, assigning a resale value to vehicles I had cherished since childhood. This was not a vague daydream. This was a highly detailed, professional-grade financial execution plan designed to strip me of everything I owned. My hands began to shake, but a strange, terrifying calm washed over my mind. I swiped the screen, switching to the next open tab. It was an email from an attorney known in our city for handling high-conflict, aggressive divorce cases. The subject line read, Drafted Petition. Attached was a PDF file. I tapped the icon and the document loaded instantly. It was a fully drafted petition for dissolution of marriage. Bradley's name was listed as the petitioner. My name was the respondent. I scrolled through the pages, reading the cold, sterile legal language demanding an equitable split of all assets currently residing in our shared accounts. The email body from the sleazy lawyer was brief and devastating. Bradley, the petition is ready to file. As we discussed, do not sign or submit anything until you can confirm the inheritance funds have fully cleared into the joint checking account. Once the money is commingled, she loses the separate property protection under state law. Let me know the second the wire hits. He was going to leave me. He had been planning this for months, smiling at me across the dinner table, holding my hand, telling me we were building an empire together. The entire marriage had become a waiting game for my uncle's death and the subsequent payout. He needed the money to land in the joint account so he could legally steal half of it before serving me with divorce papers. He had probably been consulting with this lawyer for weeks, making sure every loophole was covered, making sure I would be left completely blindsided and financially devastated. I did not cry. There were no tears, no gasps of anguish. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously calculated, that it burned away any lingering affection I had for the man sitting downstairs. The love I thought we shared was nothing but a transaction to him, a means to an end. I quickly pulled out my own phone and took clear, high-resolution photos of the spreadsheet, the email, and the drafted divorce petition. I made sure the timestamps and the lawyer's contact information were clearly visible in the images. I emailed the files to my secure private work account and immediately deleted the sent messages from my phone so there would be no trace of what I had discovered. I closed the email tab on his iPad and left the screen exactly as I had found it, glowing with his treacherous exit strategy. "Cassidy, what is taking so long?" Bradley yelled from the bottom of the stairs. "The game is back on." I grabbed the charging cable, took one last look at the digital proof of my husband's greed, and walked out of the office. "I am coming, honey," I called back, my voice steady, light, and perfectly normal. I walked down the stairs, matching his terrifying game of pretend. My heart beat a steady rhythm against my ribs, fueled by a new cold clarity. He thought he had outsmarted a naive screen decorator. He believed his manipulation was flawless, and that I was just another stepping stone to his unearned wealth. He had no idea he had just handed a loaded weapon to a woman who was about to systematically dismantle his entire life. The war had officially begun, and I was going to make sure he lost everything. I waited until I heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from the master bedroom. Bradley always slept like the dead after 2 glasses of his expensive bourbon. I slipped out of bed, grabbed my personal laptop, and went straight back to his home office. The iPad was still there. Using a secure cloud sync, I mirrored every file, every document, and every hidden folder he possessed onto my encrypted drive. As a tech professional, finding digital footprints was second nature to me. Bradley was arrogant enough to think moving files into a folder labeled Tax Archives 2022 would keep them hidden. I opened the folder and began the autopsy of my marriage. What I found was not just greed, it was desperation. Bradley was not trying to steal my $4.5 million to build an empire. He was trying to save himself from total financial annihilation. I opened a subfolder containing bank statements and crypto exchange receipts. Over the past 2 years, he had secretly funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into highly volatile cryptocurrency tokens. When the market crashed, he doubled down, taking out massive personal loans to cover his margin calls. I tallied the numbers on a fresh digital notepad. He was drowning in exactly $600,000 of high-interest debt. His so-called consulting startup was nothing but a shell company he used to secure corporate credit lines, which he then drained to cover his mounting losses. He was insolvent. If he did not get his hands on my inheritance, he was facing personal bankruptcy and potential fraud charges. The exit strategy was not a move for wealth, it was a lifeline. The financial ruin was bad enough, but Bradley had managed to intertwine his disaster with a spectacular personal betrayal. Deeper in the archive, I clicked on a PDF labeled Loft Lease Final. It was a commercial lease agreement for a high-rise luxury apartment in the most expensive downtown zip code. The monthly rent was staggering. I scrolled down to the signature page. The primary guarantor was Bradley. The secondary signature belonged to someone named Tara. I immediately recognized the name. Tara was 26 years old. She had been the corporate intern at his previous firm 2 years ago. I remembered her coming to a holiday party we hosted. She had acted overly sweet, complimenting my home, while giving Bradley lingering looks across the kitchen island. I had brushed it off back then as harmless youthful flirting. Now staring at the lease, I saw the truth. I cross-referenced the lease with the credit card statements from his failing startup. He was not just paying her rent, he was fully funding her existence. There were charges for high-end boutiques, expensive salon treatments, and weekend getaways to Napa Valley logged during the exact dates Bradley claimed he was attending out-of-state consulting conferences. He had been using the startup's credit line to play the role of a wealthy benefactor for a woman 10 years his junior, while plunging himself deeper into an inescapable financial black hole. He intended to divorce me, take my uncle's money, pay off his massive hidden debts, and ride off into the sunset with Tara. The sheer audacity of his plan was breathtaking. He had mortgaged our future to fund a secret life, and now expected my inheritance to foot the bill. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen, letting the anger crystallize into sharp, focused energy. There would be no screaming matches. There would be no tearful confrontations. He wanted a war of strategy. I was going to give him exactly that. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the following morning. I woke up early, made a pot of coffee, and acted perfectly normal. Bradley came downstairs looking cheerful and refreshed, entirely unaware that I had spent the night dissecting his digital life. He kissed my cheek, poured himself a mug of coffee, and stepped out onto the back patio to take a phone call. The sliding glass door was cracked open just an inch. As I washed my mug in the sink, I could hear his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. He was talking to his mother, Diane. Diane had always been a problem. She was a toxic, overbearing woman who treated Bradley like a flawless prince and viewed me as a temporary nuisance. She constantly criticized my long working hours, claiming I lacked the maternal warmth required to be a good wife. I stepped closer to the glass door, pressing myself against the wall to listen. Bradley had the phone on speaker, a habit he developed when he paced the patio. "Just keep playing the loving husband for one more week." Diane's voice crackled through the phone speaker, sharp and full of venom. "Once that tech geek transfers the money, you can finally leave her for Tara. You deserve a real woman, Bradley. Someone who knows how to treat a successful man, not some career-obsessed robot who stares at screens all day." A harsh laugh escaped Bradley. I know, Mom. She is completely clueless. I told her the transfer needs to happen by Monday for the business. She bought the whole empire building speech hook, line, and sinker. Tara is already looking at furniture for the loft. Once the funds clear into the joint account, I am serving the papers. Do not feel bad for her, Diane added ruthlessly. She never appreciated you. She is too selfish. Take what is yours and start your real life. I stepped back from the door, the cold tile floor grounding me. This was not just a cheating husband. This was an orchestrated financial ambush. The entire family was in on it. My mother-in-law was actively coaching her son to defraud me so he could fund his life with a 26-year-old intern. They viewed me as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained. They honestly believed I was too stupid, too trusting, and too docile to notice the trap they had set. I walked to the entryway and grabbed my purse. I picked up my car keys, gripping the cold metal in my palm. The sadness was completely gone. The shock had evaporated. All that remained was absolute predatory focus. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my inheritance, but they had drastically underestimated my ability to rewrite the rules. I opened the front door and walked out to my car. It was time to pay a visit to my brother-in-law, Jamal. The drive to my sister Megan's house took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like I was crossing into an entirely different dimension. I pulled into her driveway in the upscale suburbs, my mind racing with legal terms and financial survival tactics. Megan opened the door, looking surprised to see me so early on a Saturday morning, but the expression on my face stopped her from asking any casual questions. I asked if Jamal was home, and she immediately pointed toward his study down the hall. Jamal was not just my brother-in-law. He was a 38-year-old African-American powerhouse who operated as a senior partner at one of the most ruthless estate and tax law firms in the city. Jamal was brilliant, entirely self-made, and possessed a no-nonsense demeanor that terrified his opposing counsel. More importantly, Jamal had never liked Bradley. While my family had tolerated my husband, Jamal had always seen straight through Bradley's cheap suits and empty corporate buzzwords. Jamal respected hard work and authenticity, two things Bradley completely lacked. I walked into his mahogany-lined office and shut the heavy double doors behind me. Jamal looked up from his desk, his reading glasses pushed down on his nose. I did not bother with pleasantries. I set my encrypted laptop on his desk, opened it, and turned the screen toward him. I told him I needed him to look at the files I had pulled from Bradley's tablet the night before. Jamal leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. For the first 10 minutes, the room was absolutely silent, except for the clicking of his mouse as he navigated through the cloned hard drive. I watched his eyes scan the exit strategy spreadsheet. I watched him read the drafted divorce petition. I watched him open the commercial lease for the luxury loft co-signed by Tara. Finally, he opened the crypto exchange receipts and the massive web of personal loans totaling $600,000 in hidden debt. When Jamal finally leaned back in his leather chair, his demeanor had completely transformed. The warm, welcoming brother-in-law was gone. In his place sat an apex predator attorney shifting seamlessly into war mode. His eyes were cold, analyzing the battlefield I had just laid out in front of him. "He is trying to trap you in a textbook community property snare," Jamal said, his voice low and intensely focused. "The American legal system is very specific about inherited wealth, Cassidy. Right now, that $4.5 million from your Uncle Richard is legally considered your separate property. In a divorce, Bradley has zero claim to it. But the second you wire those funds into a joint checking account, the moment that money mingles with marital funds, even for a single minute, it legally transforms into community property. If you make that transfer on Monday morning, you are handing him $2.25 million on a silver platter." A chill ran down my spine. Bradley had framed the transfer as a step toward building our supposed empire. He had used my own desire for a healthy cooperative marriage to manipulate me into signing away my safety net. He knew exactly what he was doing. "So how do we stop him?" I asked, my voice steady. "How do I protect the money without tipping him off that I know everything?" Jamal steepled his fingers, resting his chin on them. "We do not just protect the money. We make the money a ghost. We are going to initiate an absolute legal fortress around your assets. I am setting up a South Dakota dynasty trust for you immediately. I frowned, slightly confused by the specific location. Why South Dakota? Because South Dakota has the most aggressive bulletproof asset protection laws in the entire country, Jamal explained smoothly, pulling out a fresh legal pad and uncapping his pen. It is the gold standard for generational wealth preservation. An irrevocable trust established there shields your assets from creditors' lawsuits, and most importantly, from greedy spouses in a divorce. Because the trust legally owns the assets, Bradley cannot touch them. Not a single cent. Jamal did not waste another second. He spent the next 3 hours making high-priority phone calls, leveraging his elite network. He contacted the primary executor of Uncle Richard's estate. He submitted emergency legal filings. He drafted the trust documents, making me the sole beneficiary and the sole director of the funds. Instead of the inheritance being wired to the joint account on Monday, Jamal rerouted the entire $4.5 million directly into the newly formed South Dakota Dynasty Trust. By early afternoon, the confirmation came through. The money was locked inside a legal vault that Bradley could never penetrate. It was perfectly safe. But protecting your wealth is only step one, Jamal said, pacing across his office. We have a much bigger problem on our hands, Cassidy. You are currently legally married to a man who is drowning in $600,000 of high-interest debt. Under current state laws, a judge could look at that marital debt and decide to split it between the two of you during the divorce proceedings. Bradley could argue that the crypto investments and the business loans were made for the benefit of the marriage. You could end up paying for the apartment he rented for his 26-year-old mistress. The thought of paying off the debt Bradley accumulated while cheating on me made my blood boil. He had ruined our marriage, and now the law might force me to finance his infidelity. I looked at Jamal, refusing to accept that outcome. I am not paying a single dollar for Tara's luxury loft, I stated firmly. How do we sever my liability from his garbage startup? Jamal smiled for the first time that morning. A sharp, calculating smile that made me incredibly glad he was on my side. We use his own massive ego against him. Bradley thinks he is the smartest guy in the room. He thinks you do not understand corporate finance. We are going to feed that delusion and let him walk himself right off a cliff. Jamal sat back down at his computer and began typing rapidly. He explained that we needed a post-nuptial agreement to legally separate my assets from Bradley's liabilities. A standard post-nuptial agreement, however, would immediately trigger Bradley's suspicions. If I handed him a document clearly outlining a divorce settlement, he would realize I knew about Tara and the debt. He would freeze, panic, and refuse to sign. So Jamal decided to craft the ultimate legal bait. He spent the next several hours drafting a dense, incredibly intimidating 50-page document. He titled the massive stack of paper Corporate Tax Restructuring Agreement. It is pure psychological manipulation, Jamal explained as he worked. I am packing the first 40 pages with the most aggressive, boring corporate jargon possible. Tax codes, liability restructuring clauses, enterprise scalability projections. It is exactly the kind of hollow corporate nonsense Bradley uses to make himself sound important. He will read the title and assume this is a necessary bureaucratic step to legitimize his consulting startup before receiving the millions he thinks you are transferring. Jamal was a master of his craft. He made the document look incredibly official, complete with financial charts and dense paragraphs of legal boilerplate. But the real weapon was buried deep inside the binder. On page 42, Jamal inserted a flawlessly executed airtight post-nuptial agreement. The terms were absolutely ruthless and entirely in my favor. Clause 4. A stated that Cassidy formally waives 100% of her rights interests and claims to Bradley's consulting startup and any debts or liabilities associated with it. This single paragraph completely insulated me from the $600,000 crypto hole and the commercial lease for Tara's love nest. Bradley would be forced to shoulder every single penny of his own disastrous financial choices. But Jamal did not stop there. Clause 4B contained the final nail in Bradley's coffin. In exchange for Cassidy waiving her rights to the startup, the document explicitly stated that Bradley formally waives 100% of his rights, claims, and interests in the South Dakota Dynasty Trust or any other separate property inherited by Cassidy. By signing the paper, Bradley would legally sever himself from my $4.5 million forever. Jamal printed the massive 50-page document. The printer hummed continuously for several minutes, churning out the trap we had just built. Jamal gathered the thick stack of paper and bound it inside a sleek, heavy leather folder. It looked exactly like a high-end corporate pitch deck. It looked like money, prestige, and business. Everything Bradley craved, everything his mother Diane had told him he deserved. Jamal slid the heavy leather binder across the polished mahogany desk. It stopped right in front of me. I placed my hand on the cool leather, feeling the weight of my freedom resting inside. I had walked into this house a betrayed wife facing total financial ruin. I was walking out as a woman holding a loaded gun disguised as corporate paperwork. Jamal looked at me, his expression deadly serious, but his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a brilliant lawyer who had just engineered a flawless checkmate. Now you just have to make him sign it without reading. I left Jamal's office, clutching the leather binder against my chest like a shield. The drive back to my neighborhood gave me 30 minutes to perfect my strategy. I needed to suppress every ounce of my natural confidence and transform myself into the naive, easily manipulated woman my husband and mother-in-law so desperately wanted me to be. When I pulled into my driveway, the sight of an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked near the garage told me the psychological warfare was already escalating. Diane had arrived. I unlocked the front door and walked into a house that suddenly felt entirely hostile. Diane was standing in the center of my kitchen, holding a microfiber cloth and wiping down the pristine granite countertops with an expression of intense disgust. Her designer luggage was piled aggressively in the foyer, taking up as much space as possible. Bradley was leaning against the refrigerator, drinking a sparkling water and laughing at something she had just said. When they heard my heels click against the hardwood floor, their laughter ceased, immediately replaced by identical forced smiles. "I decided to surprise you both," Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I packed a few bags and drove down for the week. I felt like you and Bradley needed some extra support right now to really reconnect. Marriage is such fragile work, especially when one partner is so terribly distracted by staring at computer screens all day." Her insult was barely disguised, but I forced my shoulders to slump and offered a weak, grateful smile. "That is so thoughtful of you, Diane," I said, keeping my voice soft and submissive. "I have just been so overwhelmed lately." "Overwhelmed?" Diane repeated, setting the cloth down and crossing her arms. "Well, of course you are overwhelmed, Cassidy. You are trying to handle things that are completely outside your wheelhouse. A good wife knows when to step back and let her husband lead. Bradley has a brilliant mind for enterprise strategy. If you truly supported his vision, you would not be holding his startup hostage over some imaginary financial fears." She did not even wait 5 minutes before launching the attack. She had clearly moved into my home with a single specific objective: to break down my resistance and ensure the $4.5 million landed safely in Bradley's hands. Over the next 4 days, my own house became a psychological pressure cooker. Diane relentlessly nitpicked every single aspect of my existence. She criticized the groceries I bought, claiming they were not nutritious enough for a high-performing executive like her son. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets and complained about the dust on the baseboards. At dinner, she would dominate the conversation, regaling us with stories of successful traditional wives who happily handed over their inheritances to build their husbands' businesses. Bradley played along perfectly. He acted like the patient, long-suffering husband who was valiantly trying to guide his stubborn wife toward the light. He would sigh deeply whenever I mentioned my job at the design agency, acting as though my career was a cute but ultimately meaningless hobby. They were running a synchronized campaign of gaslighting designed to make me feel small, incompetent, and entirely dependent on Bradley's supposed financial genius. I swallowed my pride and absorbed every insult. I let Diane patronize me. I let Bradley mansplain basic economic concepts over dinner. I played the role of the intimidated, yielding woman who was slowly crumbling under their combined intellectual superiority. It took immense willpower to keep my face perfectly composed while knowing Bradley was actively funding a commercial lease for his 26-year-old mistress with money he did not even have. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Bradley was growing agitated, pacing the living room and checking his phone constantly. His creditors were likely hounding him, and Tara was probably demanding new furniture for the downtown loft. He needed the inheritance transfer completed by Friday morning, or his entire house of cards would collapse. Diane was sitting on the sofa sipping a cup of herbal tea and watching me with narrowed, judgmental eyes. The stage was perfectly set. I went upstairs to my home office and retrieved the heavy leather binder Jamal had prepared. I carried it down the stairs, holding it awkwardly with both hands, making sure I looked visibly stressed and exhausted. I walked into the living room and stood before Bradley, taking a deep, trembling breath. "Bradley," I said, my voice pitching up slightly to convey anxiety. "You were right. I do not understand finance at all. I spent all afternoon talking to my accountant and looking over these forms, and it is just too much for me to process." Bradley stopped pacing. His eyes immediately locked onto the thick leather binder in my hands. A triumphant smirk spread across his face, and he glanced quickly at his mother. Diane leaned forward, placing her teacup on the coaster, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "What did your accountant say?" Cassidy Bradley asked, using his slow, patronizing tone. I stepped closer and set the heavy binder on the coffee table. "He said that because of the massive size of my Uncle Richard's estate, transferring the $4.5 million into our joint account is going to trigger a massive corporate tax liability for your startup. He said we need to sign this corporate tax restructuring form before I can wire the money to you tomorrow morning." I pointed nervously at the dense stack of paper. "He said this protects the business capital from federal estate penalties, but the legal jargon is completely over my head. I do not understand any of it." Bradley let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He walked over to the coffee table and picked up the binder, weighing it in his hands. He flipped open the cover and glanced at the first page. Jamal had packed the opening section with the most convoluted, aggressive tax terminology legally possible. Words like fiduciary scalability, enterprise liability shielding, and deferred capital optimization leaped off the page. "Of course you do not understand it." Cassidy Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. "This is high-level corporate tax strategy. Your accountant is just being overly cautious because he is used to dealing with personal checking accounts, not enterprise-level capital injections. This is standard bureaucratic red tape to shield the transfer." Diane stood up and walked over, patting Bradley on the shoulder. "See, Cassidy?" she murmured, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is exactly why you need to let Bradley handle the finances. He understands these complex enterprise strategies. You just need to support him and sign where he tells you to sign." I looked down at the floor, acting properly chastised. "Should we maybe have a lawyer read it first?" I asked timidly, playing my final card of reverse psychology. "It is 50 pages long, Bradley. Maybe we should wait until next week to make the transfer so someone can review it." The mere suggestion of delaying the money until next week caused a flash of genuine panic in Bradley's eyes. His fake patience vanished instantly. "We are not delaying the transfer, Cassidy," he snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. "My startup needs that liquidity tomorrow morning. I am a corporate consultant. I read contracts twice this size before breakfast. I do not need some overpriced lawyer charging me $1,000 an hour to tell me what I already know. It is a standard tax restructuring agreement." He flipped aggressively through the thick stack of papers. He did not read a single paragraph. He was completely blinded by his own ego, his desperate need for cash, and his absolute certainty that I was too stupid to orchestrate a deception. He bypassed page 42, completely entirely missing the airtight post-nuptial agreement that legally stripped him of any right to my South Dakota Dynasty Trust, while permanently shackling him to his own $600,000 mountain of debt. He flipped straight to the final signature page. Just as he uncapped his expensive fountain pen, the doorbell rang. I jumped slightly, acting startled while Diane rolled her eyes and went to answer it. A moment later, she returned to the living room, followed by a sharp-looking professional man carrying a locked briefcase. "Who is this?" Bradley asked, frowning. "My accountant said we needed a certified notary present to witness the corporate signatures," I explained, wringing my hands together anxiously. "He said it was mandatory for federal compliance involving sums over $3 million. He sent a mobile courier to make sure it was handled properly tonight." The man introduced himself as Desmond. Jamal had selected him specifically because Desmond looked exactly like a high-end financial courier used to dealing with elite corporate clients. Desmond did not smile or engage in small talk. He simply opened his briefcase, pulled out his official notary stamp, and asked for our government-issued identification. Bradley puffed out his chest, clearly enjoying the formal bureaucratic process. He handed over his driver's license with a smug expression. "See, Cassidy, this is how real business is conducted," he boasted. "You execute the paperwork, and you secure the capital." Desmond verified our identities and pointed to the designated lines on the final page of the document. "Please sign and date here indicating that you have read and agreed to the terms outlined within the complete document," Desmond instructed in a flat, clinical voice. Bradley did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He pressed his gold fountain pen against the thick paper and signed his name with a dramatic, arrogant flourish. He dated it perfectly. He had just legally severed himself from my entire inheritance and locked himself inside a burning financial building. I picked up the pen next. My hand was completely steady as I signed my own name, officially relinquishing any and all claims to his fraudulent startup and the massive debts attached to it. Desmond collected the binder, applied his official notary seal to the page, and pressed his heavy stamp down with a resounding thud. The sound echoed in the quiet living room. It was the sound of a steel trap snapping completely shut. Desmond secured the signed document back inside his briefcase, nodded politely to us, and walked out the front door. Bradley clapped his hands together, rubbing them with greedy anticipation. "There," he announced, turning to his mother with a triumphant grin, "the corporate structuring is executed. The startup is shielded." He walked over and pulled me into a tight embrace, kissing the top of my head. "You did the right thing tonight, Cassidy. Tomorrow morning, you wire those funds into the joint account and we start building our real life." I rested my cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, arrogant beat of his heart. I kept my face carefully hidden from him, and Diane allowing myself one single cold smile. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I nodded slowly against his shirt. "Yes, Bradley," I whispered softly. "First thing tomorrow morning. Everything changes." The morning of my 34th birthday began with a beautifully orchestrated lie. I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, waiting for Bradley to come downstairs. Jamal had instructed the trust managers in South Dakota to generate a perfectly authentic-looking wire transfer confirmation screen. It showed the full $4,500,000 moving out of my uncle's estate and landing squarely into an account bearing Bradley's startup routing number. What Bradley did not know was that the routing number belonged to a ghost account, a financial dead end completely controlled by my irrevocable trust. The money was already safely locked away behind impenetrable legal walls, but the screen displayed a flawless illusion of compliance. Bradley walked into the kitchen tying his expensive silk tie. I called him over and pointed to the laptop screen. "Happy birthday to me," I said, keeping my tone light and appropriately submissive. "The capital injection is complete, Bradley. The funds have officially cleared into the account." Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening with pure, unrestrained greed. He actually placed his hand on the edge of the monitor, as if he could feel the digital currency flowing into his possession. He let out a loud, victorious shout, grabbed me by the waist, and spun me around the kitchen. He was entirely euphoric. He honestly believed he had just successfully stolen my family legacy and secured his financial freedom. "We are celebrating tonight," he announced, practically vibrating with adrenaline. "Put on that black silk dress I like. We are going to Prime Cut to celebrate your birthday and our new empire. My mother is coming too. We have a lot of important things to talk about. Prime Cut was the most pretentious steakhouse in downtown Chicago. It was the kind of establishment where corporate climbers went to show off their quarterly bonuses, complete with dim lighting, heavy leather boots, and excessively priced cuts of meat. When we arrived that evening, Diane was already seated at a secluded corner booth sipping a dry martini. She looked me up and down with an expression of barely concealed contempt, but she raised her glass to Bradley with absolute adoration. The dinner was a masterclass in narcissistic gloating. Bradley immediately ordered a $600 bottle of champagne and a massive tomahawk ribeye. He spent the entire first course talking loudly about his vision for the future, dropping meaningless buzzwords like market disruption and aggressive scalability. He did not ask me a single question about my day. He did not even say happy birthday. He just drank his expensive champagne and exchanged knowing, triumphant looks with his mother across the table. I ate my salad quietly, playing the role of the subdued, overshadowed wife one last time. I watched him inflate his own ego, knowing exactly how empty his bank accounts actually were. When the waiter cleared our main courses, Bradley leaned back against the plush leather booth and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He reached down into his leather briefcase resting on the seat beside him. A normal wife might have expected a small jewelry box, or perhaps an envelope containing tickets for a romantic weekend getaway. Instead, he pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and slid it aggressively across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right next to my water glass. I looked at the envelope and then up at him. "What is this?" I asked, feigning innocent confusion. Bradley took a slow sip of his champagne, the charming husband act evaporating completely. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by cold, calculating arrogance. "Those are divorce papers, Cassidy. I filed them this afternoon, right after the wire transfer cleared." He did not even have the decency to wait until the weekend. He was so desperate to execute his exit strategy and run to his mistress that he dropped the bomb on my literal birthday in front of his mother. I stared at the envelope, letting a heavy silence stretch across the table. "I am leaving you," he stated loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "The truth is, I have been miserable for years. You are suffocating, Cassidy. You care more about your little computer designs than you do about being a real partner. You lack ambition, you lack vision, and frankly, you lack the sophistication I need in a wife." Diane let out a sharp, cruel laugh, setting her martini glass down with a clink. "Do not look so surprised, Cassidy," she sneered, leaning across the table. "My son is a CEO now. He needs a wife who matches his status, not a tired computer worker who complains about working late. You were a starter wife. You should be grateful he stayed with you this long and tolerated your boring lifestyle." Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He wanted to twist the knife to make sure I was completely broken before he walked away. "I am not just leaving you, Cassidy. I am leaving you for Tara. You remember Tara, right? My former intern. She is 26, vibrant, and actually knows how to treat a successful man. We signed a lease on a loft downtown. She understands the high-level demands of my career. She is the supportive partner I actually deserve. I want you packed and moved out of the townhome by this weekend, so she can start decorating the place." This was the exact moment they expected me to shatter. They waited eagerly for the tears, the begging, the hysterical public breakdown. They wanted a dramatic spectacle so they could justify their cruelty by painting me as an unstable, emotional wreck. They expected me to throw my drink in his face, to scream at him for his infidelity, to plead with him to stay and work on our marriage. I did absolutely none of that. I felt an incredible, profound sense of peace wash over me. The monster was finally out of the shadows, and the legal trap Jamal and I had built was perfectly set. My heart rate did not even spike. My breathing remained slow and controlled. Bradley tapped the manila envelope with his index finger, outlining his financial demands with clinical, predatory precision. "The petition is very straightforward. Because the $4.5 million is now sitting in a marital account, it is legally community property. I am taking exactly $2.25 million. I am also taking the townhome since I put the initial down payment on it originally. You can keep your little design agency and your personal retirement accounts. If you sign this quietly, I will let you keep the vintage cars your uncle left you. If you fight me, I will drag this out in court and drain every cent you have left on aggressive legal fees. I sat perfectly still, listening to his delusions of grandeur. I did not reach for the envelope. I simply picked up my heavy linen napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I looked at Bradley, and then at Diane. They were both smirking, waiting for my inevitable surrender. I caught the eye of our waiter, who had been nervously hovering near the wine station, trying to pretend he was not listening to our table. I raised my hand and signaled him over. He approached tentatively, clearly sensing the highly toxic atmosphere. "Could you please bring me a separate check for the house salad and my glass of sparkling water?" I asked the waiter, my voice completely steady and polite. The waiter nodded quickly and rushed off to print the receipt, eager to escape the tension. Bradley frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his brow furrowing in confusion. I ignored him. I pulled my slim wallet from my purse and waited patiently. When the waiter returned, I handed him my corporate credit card, adding a very generous tip for the awkward situation. I signed the receipt, put my card away, and stood up from the booth. I smoothed the front of my black silk dress, looking down at the two people who thought they had just ruined my life. "Cassidy, did you not hear a single word I just said?" Bradley snapped, his voice rising in genuine irritation. "I am divorcing you. I am taking half the money and the house. You need to take these papers." I looked dead into his eyes. There was no sadness in my gaze, no panic, no heartbreak, only absolute chilling certainty. "Are you sure you want an uncontested divorce with no mediation?" I asked, my tone conversational and completely devoid of emotion. Bradley puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant posture, feeling the eyes of the restaurant on him. "Yes, I want you to sign the papers and get out of my life." "Perfect," I replied, offering him a small, razor-sharp smile. "My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow at 9 a.m. I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not look back. I did not rush. I walked through the elegant, crowded dining room with the perfect, unshakable posture of a woman who had just won a war without firing a single shot. Behind me, I could almost feel their utter confusion radiating through the restaurant. They had prepared for a weeping, devastated victim. They had no idea how to process my icy indifference. I left them sitting at their expensive booth, staring at the unsigned divorce papers and a massive steakhouse bill they would now have to pay for themselves using credit cards that were already maxed out. Exactly 7 days after I walked out of that steakhouse, leaving Bradley and his mother in total confusion, I stepped into the polished glass and steel lobby of Jamal's downtown law firm. The air conditioning was crisp, and the atmosphere was dead silent. I was wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. I felt invincible. A receptionist led us into the main executive boardroom. The room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Bradley was already sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. He had worn his flashiest suit, clearly trying to project the image of a wealthy tech founder. Beside him sat a man who looked like he belonged on a late-night television commercial advertising cheap injury settlements. His name was Vince. Vince wore a poorly fitted pinstripe suit and had a loud, aggressive demeanor. They were chatting and laughing with supreme arrogance when the heavy oak doors swung open. I stepped into the room first. I did not say a single word. I pulled out a chair across from Bradley and sat down, crossing my legs with total composure. Bradley sneered at me, leaning back in his chair. He thought my silence was fear. He honestly believed I was showing up to surrender my inheritance. Then Jamal walked into the room. Jamal did not just enter a room, he commanded it. He was dressed in a bespoke navy suit that radiated elite corporate power. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, and his expression was a terrifying mask of absolute professional zero tolerance. He walked to the head of the table, radiating the kind of high-level legal authority that instantly made the air in the room feel incredibly thin. Bradley's smug smile faltered immediately. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting from me to the imposing attorney standing beside me. Vince puffed out his chest, trying to compensate for the sudden dramatic shift in the power dynamic. "Let us get right to the point," Vince barked, slapping a thin folder onto the table. "My client is entitled to half of the marital assets. We have documentation showing a transfer of $4.5 million into a joint account. We are demanding a cash settlement of $2.25 million wired by the end of the week. Furthermore, my client retains 100% ownership and operational control of his consulting startup. You sign the papers today, or we take this to court and drain your client on legal fees." Bradley nodded enthusiastically, tapping his pen against the mahogany wood. "You heard him, Cassidy. I am being generous here. I am letting you keep your little design agency. Just hand over the $2.25 million and I will gladly walk away. You can go back to your quiet life and I will go build my future. Do not make this harder than it has to be." Jamal did not sit down. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his leather briefcase on the table and popped the golden clasps. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent boardroom. Jamal extracted a thick, familiar stack of paper bound in a heavy black folder. It was the corporate tax restructuring agreement Bradley had so eagerly signed in our living room. Jamal slid the document across the polished surface of the table until it stopped perfectly positioned between Bradley and his lawyer. "Before we discuss any division of assets," Jamal said, his voice smooth and deadly calm, "we must first review the binding legal framework governing this dissolution. Specifically, the post-nuptial agreement your client executed precisely 8 days ago." Vince frowned, snatching the document from the table. "Post-nuptial agreement. We do not know anything about a post-nuptial agreement. My client never signed a divorce settlement." "He did not read it," Jamal corrected coldly. "But he certainly signed it. I direct your attention to page 42. Vince flipped frantically through the dense pages until he reached the designated section. His eyes began to dart back and forth across the legal text. Bradley leaned over, trying to read the paper, but clearly failing to comprehend the dense legal terminology. "What is this?" Bradley demanded, his voice pitching up with sudden nervous energy. "Cassidy told me that was a corporate tax form to shield the startup before she wired the money. I saw the confirmation screen. The money is in the joint account." Jamal offered a smile completely devoid of warmth. "You saw a routing confirmation for a ghost account created and fully controlled by a South Dakota dynasty trust. That trust is irrevocable. My client transferred the entirety of her inherited $4.5 million directly into that protective entity. It never touched a marital account. It was never commingled. And therefore, it remains 100% her separate property under the law." Bradley jumped out of his chair, his face flushing a bright, angry red. "That is a lie. I saw the screen. You tricked me. That is fraud." "It is asset protection," Jamal replied smoothly, "and it is completely legal. But the truly remarkable part of this transaction is the document currently in your counsel's hands. By signing that agreement, Bradley, you formally and irrevocably waived any and all rights, claims, and interests to the South Dakota Dynasty Trust. You surrendered your claim to her inheritance willingly with a certified mobile notary present." Vince was sweating heavily. He wiped his forehead, staring at Bradley's flamboyant signature at the bottom of the page. "He actually signed this," Vince muttered, shaking his head. "It is notarized. It is completely airtight." I sat silently, watching the blood drain from Bradley's face. The realization was hitting him like a physical blow. There was no $2.25 million. There was no payout. He had spent months manipulating me, lying to me, and scheming with his mother to steal my legacy. He had orchestrated an entire exit strategy based on an illusion, and with a single stroke of his gold fountain pen, he had burned his own blueprint to the ground. But Jamal was not finished. If the loss of the inheritance was the trap closing, then Clause 4B was the execution. Jamal pulled a second, slimmer folder from his briefcase. While page 42 strips your client of any claim to the trust, Jamal continued, directing his attention entirely to Vince. It also addresses the division of the remaining marital assets. specifically the consulting startup your client insisted on retaining. Bradley swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the conference table. I keep my company. That was always the deal. You waived your rights to my business, Cassidy. I did. I spoke for the first time, my voice ringing clear and steady across the room. I formally waived 100% of my rights to your consulting startup. I want absolutely nothing to do with it. Jamal opened the slim folder, revealing a stack of forensic accounting reports. By waiving her rights to the business, my client is also legally insulated from its liabilities. And thanks to a thorough forensic audit of your corporate accounts, we have a very clear picture of what those liabilities entail. Jamal began sliding the highlighted bank statements across the table one by one like a dealer passing out a losing hand of cards. Your client is currently holding $600,000 in highly leveraged debt stemming from catastrophic cryptocurrency margin calls, Jamal stated, outlining the financial bloodbath. Furthermore, your client has tied the startup corporate credit lines to a commercial lease for a luxury downtown loft, co-signed by a 26-year-old named Tara. Bradley let out a strangled gasp, collapsing backward into his chair. He looked like he could not breathe. Because my client waived her interest in the business, Jamal concluded, delivering the final devastating blow. Your client is recognized as the 100% sole owner and operator of the enterprise. Therefore, Bradley is 100% solely responsible for the $600,000 debt, the broken crypto loans, and the entirety of the luxury commercial lease. My client is legally shielded from paying a single cent toward his infidelity or his gambling. Vince stared at the forensic accounting documents and then looked at Bradley with absolute disgust. Vince was a cheap lawyer who took aggressive cases expecting a massive payout from a wealthy spouse. He had expected to take a percentage of $2.25 million. Instead, he was sitting next to a man who was over $500,000 in the hole, facing personal bankruptcy and completely cut off from any marital assets. You lied to me, Vince hissed at Bradley, grabbing his briefcase off the table. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me this was a guaranteed settlement. You are broke. You cannot even afford my retainer. Vince Bradley choked out, reaching for the lawyer's sleeve. Wait, we can fight this. We can claim I signed under duress. You signed a 50-page post-nuptial agreement with a certified notary while trying to hide massive debt and an active mistress, Vince shouted, pulling his arm away violently. I am not touching this mess. I am formally withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately. Have fun in bankruptcy court. Vince stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him. The echo rang through the room, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Bradley was left sitting entirely alone at his side of the massive table. His chest was heaving. He was hyperventilating, his hands gripping his hair as the totality of his ruin crashed down upon him. He had no money. He had no lawyer. He was buried in insurmountable debt, and his mistress's expensive loft was solely his financial burden. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket with calm, deliberate precision. I looked down at the man who had tried to destroy me. He was nothing now, just an empty, arrogant shell crushed by his own greed. I walked out of the conference room, leaving Bradley to suffocate in the disaster of his own making. Jamal walked beside me, his presence a steady reminder that I was protected, defended, and victorious. We stepped into the elevator, and as the doors slid shut, I finally let out a long, deep breath. The war was over. The aftermath, however, was just beginning to unfold, and it was swifter and more brutal than I could have ever predicted. The dominoes began to fall the very next morning. Bradley, desperate and panicked, went straight to the downtown luxury loft seeking comfort from Tara. But Tara was not looking for a bankrupt man drowning in debt. She had signed up for a wealthy CEO who could fund her lavish lifestyle, not a financial liability. The moment Bradley confessed that he had lost his startup, lost the divorce settlement, and was solely responsible for a $600,000 deficit, Tara dropped her supportive partner act entirely. She packed her designer bags, the ones Bradley had paid for, using his company credit line, and walked out the door before lunch. She officially broke the commercial lease, leaving Bradley completely on the hook for the massive penalties and the remaining rent. He was entirely alone. With nowhere else to turn, Bradley ran back to the only person who had ever enabled his toxic behavior. He went crawling back to Diane. But Diane quickly learned that coaching her son to defraud his wife carried a massive real-world cost. Bradley was facing aggressive litigation from his crypto creditors and the furious commercial landlord. To keep her precious golden boy out of federal court and save him from total financial ruin, Diane had to liquidate everything she owned. She was forced to put her pristine suburban home on the market for a fast cash sale. She drained her own retirement account, sold her luxury vehicles, and pawned her expensive jewelry just to keep Bradley out of prison. Within a month, Diane went from holding court at high-end steakhouses to moving into a cramped, low-income apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her social standing evaporated overnight. The wealthy friends she used to boast to stopped returning her calls, embarrassed by the public nature of Bradley's financial collapse. They were left with nothing but each other and the bitter realization that their greed had destroyed their lives. While they were busy losing everything, I was busy building my new life. Using the safe, secure funds from my South Dakota Dynasty Trust, I purchased a breathtaking, ultra-modern luxury condo in the heart of the city. It featured soaring glass walls, white marble floors, and an advanced biometric security system. It was a fortress of peace, entirely my own. I poured my energy back into my design career, launching an independent UX agency that thrived from day one. I was finally living the life I deserved, free from constant criticism and daily gaslighting. But Bradley could not accept his defeat gracefully. 6 weeks after the disastrous settlement meeting, I was standing in the lobby of my new building, chatting with the concierge when I saw him. Bradley was pacing outside the heavy, secure glass doors. He looked completely unrecognizable. His tailored designer suits were gone, replaced by wrinkled casual clothes. He looked exhausted, pale, and thoroughly defeated. The moment he spotted me in the lobby, he pushed through the outer revolving doors and threw himself against the inner security glass. He dropped to his knees right there on the polished marble floor. He started sobbing loudly, pressing his hands against the glass, leaving greasy smudge marks on the pristine surface. Even through the thick, soundproof pane, I could hear him pleading. He was begging for a second chance. He shouted that the extreme stress of his business had clouded his judgment. He screamed that Tara had brainwashed him and manipulated him into signing the commercial lease. He was using the exact same gaslighting tactics, trying to play the victim, hoping my empathy would override my logic one last time. But my empathy for him was completely dead. I did not flinch. I did not step closer to the glass. I did not yell or gloat or offer him a single shred of acknowledgement. I just stood there, looking down at the pathetic man who had once tried to convince me I was worthless. I picked up the sleek phone on the concierge desk, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley's tear-streaked face. I calmly instructed the security team to remove the trespasser from the premises and to call the police if he ever returned. I turned my back on him and walked toward the private elevators, never saying a single word to him again. I let the security guards drag him away while I ascended to my penthouse. Later that evening, I sat on my private balcony, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. I held a glass of expensive red wine, watching the city skyline glitter against the night sky. The air was cool and crisp. For the first time in years, my mind was entirely quiet. I thought about Megan and Jamal coming over for dinner the following night. They were my true family. Jamal had used his brilliant legal mind to protect me, and Megan had offered unwavering support when my world was falling apart. They showed me what actual loyalty looked like. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the rich flavor settle. I realized then that financial independence is not just about having wealth. It is a woman's absolute best armor against gaslighting and manipulation. Bradley thought he could use my heart to access my bank account, but he severely underestimated my mind. I protected my peace, secured my legacy, and took out the trash. Never let a narcissist convince you that you aren't smart enough to handle your own worth. Have you ever had to outsmart a toxic partner? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories of taking back your power. The most empowering lesson from Cassidy's journey is that financial independence is your ultimate armor against manipulation. When faced with a partner who systematically tries to gaslight you, emotional confrontations rarely work. Instead, quiet strategy, airtight legal boundaries, and an unshakable belief in your own intellect are your absolute best defenses. Bradley relied on the illusion that Cassidy was too naive to understand her own wealth. By choosing cold logic over a dramatic meltdown, she protected her peace and secured her legacy. Never let anyone convince you that you are incapable of managing your own worth. Please share your own experiences and comment below.